the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. The first lesson of this Mass was taken from St. Paul's epistle to the Galatians. And to understand the content and the tone, which was one of righteous anger, one needs to understand the circumstances, the principal reason for which St. Paul wrote this epistle. Working on the Galatian churches, which were principally Gentiles who had been brought to Christian belief from the pagan world, working upon them in the absence of St. Paul, were very conservative Jewish Christians, which are referred to as Judaizers. Judaizers is a generic term to describe very ultra-conservative Jewish Christians, probably comprised mostly of former Pharisees, who were insistent that in order for the Gentiles to be fully in covenant and thereby saved or able to be saved, they must adopt the old ritual practices of Judaism, first and foremost, circumcision. And so throughout this epistle, St. Paul, who was righteously angry about the Judaizers who are undermining the authentic gospel that no longer requires circumcision to be in covenant, is not only righteously angry, principally at these Judaizers and disappointed in the Gentile Christians, but puts forward a number of arguments to convince these Gentile Christians that not only is circumcision of no value to them, but it will impede them. It will put an unnecessary condition upon them and, in effect, make Christ's sacrifice on the cross and their faith rendered useless. There's reason to believe that the work of the Judaizers continued on for decades after St. Paul addressed this to the Galatians. We can probably assume that throughout that first century, working on 2 or 3 generations, these Judaizers continued to preach and teach their false gospels. Now that is no longer an issue at all since that first century of the church. But now instead of Judaizers, we have another movement or group within the church that seeks to force something upon others. Let's call them the Novus Ordoizers. How about that? The Novus Ordoizers, who have sought for 50, 60 years, let's call it a good 50 years plus, to force upon every single Catholic without exception the so-called Novus Ordo Mass. And if you're at this Mass, unless this is your first time, you know what I mean when I refer to the Novus Ordo Mass. The Novus Ordoizers have been active since the start of the 70s and the late 60s, really. And there have been, throughout the decades since then, those who have chosen and with great hardship found ways to continue to have available or make available the traditional form of the Mass, the Tridentine form of the Mass, as well as the whole of tradition. But this has been with great labor and hardship and often suffering. One archbishop in particular founded a society in order to preserve the traditional form of the Mass and sacraments and tradition as a whole. There have been other societies and fraternities that have come into existence since then. There have been those who found refuge for tradition within diocesan institutions, but under very severe restrictions. Many dioceses without such Mass and sacraments entirely, others with very limited numbers and availability of the traditional Mass and sacrament. And many of you are very personally aware of this, for having been in the fight for decades to preserve tradition for yourselves, your children, and for the sake of others. But just like the Judaizers, the Novus Ordoizers are relentless. And most recently, some power within the Vatican system, who clearly is a Novus Ordoizer, has determined that in 1 week's time, the traditional form of the Mass will be banned entirely from St. Peter's Basilica side altars on the main floor and area of St. Peter's Basilica. The only allowance for the traditional form of the Mass will in effect be in a crypt, only by so-called authorized priests, which term is yet to be explained, and in very specific times. So again, within a week's time, in St. Peter's Basilica, where it has been common practice for centuries for private Masses to be offered at side altars, especially by pilgrims and for pilgrims, and that has included the traditional form of the Mass, all private Masses, in particular the Tridentine form of the Mass, will be banned. And in the case of the traditional Mass, will be limited to a crypt. So the work of the Novus Ordoizers continues, but as surely as the undermining and work of those Judaizers ultimately failed and came to an end, in God's time and God's manner, someday the work of the Novus Ordoizers will also come to an end and tradition will triumph. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost.